Hello, I'm Chirag Shiridaria, consultant cardiologist at Oxford University Hospitals and cardiovascular and metabolic therapeutic area head at Fortrea. I'm joined again today by Chris Farina, CEO of Abcentra, a clinical phase biopharma company focused on inflammation in cardiovascular disease. In this second episode, we continue our conversation on coronary inflammation, this time turning our attention to the clinical development journey, the role of novel imaging biomarkers, and how we're working together to bring innovative therapies such as ortikumab to patients.
So one of the big problems we have with cardiovascular disease is despite having a multitude of therapies available and despite significant campaigns to target modifiable risk factors such as smoking, coronary artery disease and cardiovascular disease in particular still remains the largest cause of mortality and morbidity worldwide. And part of that reason is that there are a significant number of patients who we fail to identify as being at risk of a heart attack before they have an event. And this risk that patients have is primarily driven by coronary inflammation. So the vision is for quantification and estimation of coronary inflammation from CCTA, which is already a first-line investigation and a Class 1A indication, the highest level of evidence already in both European and American cardiology guidelines, as well as in a multitude of other countries. The vision is that we are already doing a lot of CCTA, but with this additional analysis that allows us to quantify coronary inflammation, we are able to identify a large number of patients who are at risk of future events before they've had their events. And most importantly, we're identifying patients who are unaware that they are at risk, and their risk is not currently captured by existing risk calculators or assessment methods. And indeed, recent data has shown that we will reclassify patients, we will reclassify approximately 50% of patients using this technology and change their clinical management if this information on coronary inflammation and the associated risk is provided to clinicians. So that leads to tangible changes in patient management that will influence clinical outcome. But part of the issue is that we see a significant number of patients, at least 8 to 10% of patients, who despite taking optimal medical therapy, namely statins, other lipid-modifying therapies, ACE inhibition, antiplatelet therapy, beta blockade if appropriate, we still see a significant proportion of patients who still have high levels of coronary inflammation despite taking these therapies. So there is a significant unmet need in this patient population, which needs to be met by novel therapeutic agents. So building on that point, having heard about novel imaging biomarkers to quantify coronary inflammation, I'm interested to learn more, Chris, as to what role FAI score and quantification of coronary inflammation using CCTA has firstly played in Abcentra's development to date, but also what role you see it playing in current and future studies that Abcentra hopes to conduct with ortikumab.
That's a great question, Chirag. So to set the stage, ortikumab has been a molecule that is almost the original science now goes back a couple of decades. This concept of being able to use oxidized LDL as a way to target pro-inflammatory macrophages in a plaque-targeted technology. Ortikumab has now been through 4 clinical trials, has a robust safety database in its early clinical studies. And the most recent study, which we conducted in a population of patients with a history of psoriasis, was particularly interesting because you had mentioned that 8 to 10% of patients in the clinically indicated CT population are coming back that despite being on best therapy, guideline-based best therapies available today, are coming out with still having residual inflammation that's not addressed. It's being picked up by the diagnostic and it's not addressed by current therapies. I think the psoriasis study that Abcentra conducted over the last couple of years and published provides an actually interesting glimpse into the potential unmet need being larger. And why I say that is because this was a population of psoriatic patients that was not having chest pains, not under the care of a cardiologist. And yet about half of the population was coming back with a high degree of inflammation as assessed by the Carey Heart imaging technology and device and the FAI scores, which is suggestive that if the screening test of coronary CT angiography and PHI was potentially more widely applied, there would be yet an even bigger population with residual coronary inflammation not being adequately treated. In the case of ortikumab, we envision that ortikumab first will be developed in the secondary prevention setting, so that for the patients that have the highest degree of residual inflammation despite receiving the best standard of care. So not only the patients that you mentioned in the clinically indicated population, but really patients with a recent acute coronary syndrome where they have an infarct that's peaking an inflammatory stimulus in the heart. This is where we think that ortikumab could make a very big impact. And we are conducting now a trial called the Fortify study. And this is a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial to test 2 doses of ortikumab against a placebo with standard of care in a post-MI population with residual coronary inflammation as a requirement to get into the trial. And the idea of this trial is to evaluate the effect of ortikumab on top of guideline-based secondary prevention standard of care management to show that ortikumab can give an additional benefit to patients. So as far as that's our vision for a first indication of ortikumab, giving it in the secondary prevention setting, particularly after an acute coronary syndrome, but with the potential to expand into other populations. One of my questions to you, Chirag, is in the primary prevention setting, especially with these patients that are being identified by the device, not only in the primary, but in the secondary prevention setting, what do we know about the impact of current treatments and therapies to be able to help with this coronary inflammation that's being identified by the device?
So I think one of the most interesting findings from the work that we've done looking at FAI score in patients is how many patients have high degrees of coronary inflammation. And what's been particularly interesting is the number of patients who have very high degrees of coronary inflammation who have normal coronary arteries. So we used to think that if you have a normal coronary CT angiogram and by normal I mean no evidence of plaque, no evidence of coronary calcium, we used to believe that that those patients are well. They almost get a badge saying that your heart health is good, your coronary arteries are good for the next 10 years, no need to worry. But what we're actually finding is that there is a significant proportion of patients who, while they may have normal coronary arteries by conventional analysis, actually have very high levels of coronary inflammation, very high PHI scores, and as a result, have a very high relative risk of future heart attack. Now, their absolute risk may still be relatively low because clearly the biggest driver of cardiovascular death and MI is age, but their relative risk can be up to 10 to 20 times higher compared to patients who have normal coronary arteries who do not have evidence of coronary inflammation. So the real challenge now for cardiologists going forward is, and indeed, having conversations with cardiologists, the challenge now is, what is a normal patient? Because we used to think that you could have two identical patients, both may have similar risk factor profiles. So for example, we could have two patients in their early 50s. They may both be diabetic. They may both have very similar CT coronary angiograms by conventional analysis, but they may be at wildly differing risk levels because of the degree of coronary inflammation. And to give you an idea, they're in those two patient groups I painted, the difference in their absolute risk of having a fatal cardiac event over the next 8 to 10 years can be as much as 7 to 8-fold different between those two patients who have very similar risk factor profiles based on conventional analysis, simply by looking at the degree of inflammation in their coronary arteries. And if we really want to make inroads into changing future risk and preventing heart attacks, then what we need are novel therapies that will allow us to do that beyond statins alone. And that's really where the real excitement comes with a drug such as ortikumab, as looking ahead, its potential to be used in a primary prevention population, because that's really how we're going to impact public health, by earlier identification and earlier targeted treatment of those patients with effective coronary-specific therapeutic agents. So, Chris, one of the questions that I wanted to also discuss with you is conducting clinical trials in this patient population can be a challenge. So I'm interested to hear what challenges you have faced so far in setting up a clinical trial program, and in particular how Fortrea has been supporting you in addressing these challenges when conducting a clinical trial in this patient population.
Yeah, I think designing clinical trials can be very complex. You need a lot of different expertise to converge on the design, and in particular when you're doing something very novel. You're using a novel endpoint, you're evaluating a drug or a population, or using an endpoint that others have not necessarily, a path that others have not necessarily walked down a lot. Pulling from other experience out there is a lot of the times not possible. So for us, understanding, that we are looking at a plaque targeted therapy, and we want to design a clinical trial where the reason to believe that the biological activity is compelling and robust was the strongest possible, and would really make a very big clinical impact. We really wanted access to a large group and a diverse set of subject matter experts. And this is where, our partnership with Fortrea has stood out, whether it be experts in cardiovascular disease biology, whether expertise in coronary CT imaging, and of course, statistics, as well as, the operations of a cardiovascular clinical trial, which are non-trivial in terms of knowing the right sites, knowing the right, sites that have the capability to do this type of advanced imaging on the cutting edge. These are all unique challenges that we faced at Abcentra, and one where, the partnerships that we built in drug development really make a big difference in our ability to effectively address these challenges and design clinical research for maximal impact.
Looking ahead, Chris, to the future, as you mentioned, you're at a very exciting stage where the Fortify trial has just started recruitment. Where do you see the coronary inflammation field in 5 years' time? And in particular, where would you like Abcentra to be in 5 years' time?
I think in 5 years, hopefully, we'll have more tools than we have available today and used in clinical practice, including colchicine and maybe others in the first generation of anti-inflammatory therapies. I think that in 5 years, with this program well into phase 3, based on hopefully success in the Fortify study and identifying doses that can go to phase 3, we will be knocking on the door of a new era of cardiovascular medicine where plaque-targeted therapies will look like a very eminent reality, where the clinical community will be really well versed in understanding the ability to now use coronary CT imaging and think about inflammation as a risk factor in a way that they can't today necessarily, based on the most of the tests available prior to Caristo coming on the scene. I think the vision for the next 5 and 10 years is getting after this disease in a more specific manner, in a plaque specific manner, and looking at the pipeline of cardiovascular medicines coming. We think that ortikumab is really well positioned for that era as one of the first drugs coming into late stage development with that profile.
I hope that we will see the first drugs approved for the treatment of coronary inflammation. I hope that we see the broader acceptance in clinical guidelines and indeed clinical practice that the measurement and quantification of coronary inflammation becomes standard of care and one of the key pillars of risk stratification and risk calculation in our patients. And my other hope is that we also see regulators embracing the concept of coronary inflammation and indeed plaque-based metrics as potential surrogate biomarkers that will allow us to accelerate the approval of drugs to meet this incredibly important, I believe, unmet need. In other words, for the treatment of patients with coronary artery disease who have significant residual inflammatory risk. Because I think that we stand on the precipice of being able to not only identify these patients, which we can do already now very well with regulatory cleared tools, but also in being able to prescribe treatments that we know can be effective in reducing the risk of those patients of having future events. And I look forward to ortikumab leading the field in the treatments that we can use to modify this risk in our patients.
It's an exciting vision, and it's one where we can imagine much better patient outcomes tomorrow than we are able to achieve today. And it's a really exciting future to look forward to for patients and physicians and the clinical community alike.
And I think the mission statements of both Fortrea and Abcentra are perfectly aligned in putting patients first. Our role is to design solid, proper, validated clinical studies that allow us to test a scientific hypothesis. And we see what the results yield. But I remain incredibly optimistic for Abcentra, for ortikumab and the Fortify trial, and look forward to hearing more about the results of Fortify over the coming years.
Likewise. Appreciate it, Chirag.
Across these 2 episodes, we've explored the evolving science of coronary inflammation, from understanding its role in residual cardiovascular risk to the development of targeted therapies like ortikumab. We've seen how advances in imaging, particularly through CCTA and the development of FAI score, are reshaping how we identify risk and personalized treatment decisions. And we've discussed the challenges and opportunities in bringing these innovations through clinical trials and ultimately into routine clinical care. It's an exciting time for cardiovascular medicine, and I'm hopeful that with continued collaboration between clinicians, researchers, and industry, we'll be able to deliver better outcomes for patients worldwide. Thank you for joining us.